Welcome. What you are listening to right now is an audiobook podcast in the science fiction fantasy genre. And here you will listen to episodic installments of a story I call HYPNAGOGUE. HYPNAGOGUE also lives on Substack under the same name that you see here on the podcast. There you can read the story, and you can also catch some extra illustrations that I have created using our handy-dandy ChatGPT. My name is Lauren, and the world you're about to enter is one that I have been writing and thinking about for over 5 years now. It's a dizzying world of contradictions, illusions, and unrelenting change. One that has helped me digest what is going on in our own world and even find some peace with it. It has also been for me an enormous wellspring of pure fun. Be warned, dear listener, should you choose to accept it, you and I are now embarking on a rather fabulous adventure. I hope you enjoy it. Without further ado, here is HYPNAGOGUE, Chapter 1, An Extinction of Death. There was once a man named Elufeus who died in the old way. I was there when it happened, alongside his 3 sons. Permitted a leave from their various employers, each made his return to their childhood home and their father's post for 83 years, a lighthouse beside the obsidian sea. The lighthouse was of a modest height, elevated less by its own walls than by the dusky cliffs that lined the shore and towered hundreds of feet over the waters. I remember the cliffs and their darkness, the way they faded away as night slipped over the sky. Next to the lighthouse was the keeper's cottage, sitting like a pet at its feet, small but steadfast. This was the little house the 3 boys grew up in. In the rainy seasons of summer, they'd slept with the windows left open, and the unending sound of droplets battering the roof permeated even their dreams. In the cold, snow-crusted months, their father whittled little figurines for them to play with by the fire. One by one, each of them had aged out of their juvenility period and indenturement term, and were obligated to leave their father's side to take up vocations. The 2 older brothers found work on farms, and the youngest, a bright, resourceful young man of no more than 19, was being educated as a temperament hypnotist at a missionary school far away. The 3 grown men thought of Elufeus with great tenderness and devotion, but the circumstance of their stations did not permit certain luxuries like taking care of an ailing old man. Fortunately, I had gone there, and it was I who had cared for Elufeus those last 15 years as he fell into old age. I lived with him there for no money, as I have no use for money, and I cared for him and his lighthouse. Elufeus felt proud. As he lay on his deathbed, he looked up at his sons and saw each of them capped with the same flat, black head of hair. There was a dank, stony sheen to the color, like the walls of a cave at night by flame light. It was their mother's hair. When he saw them all together like this, it reminded him of her. Elufeus and his wife had done what only the smallest sliver of mankind can still do. They had borne 3 natural children by blood. They say that once there was a world where all children were born in this way, of 2 people making love. Instead, we live here, and those like Elufeus and his sons are few in number, and fewer each year. There was an awkwardness between myself and Elufeus's sons. They were now strangers in their own home under the hospitality of a strange man, one who climbed their stairs and washed their dishes and swept their floors as though he knew them. And I did. This place had become my home, the lighthouse, the keeper's house, the cliffs. I knew their rhythms. I knew them better than they did, at least by that time. This made them rather uncomfortable. Each night, we sat at the table and had little to say to each other. One evening we sat down for the usual meal, salted cod from the cellar and root-pickled mussels. As was often the case, a long fog had hung over the sea, and the stove, powered by solar cells out back in the garden, went uncharged. It was a cold meal. I restrained what measures I could have easily taken. Elufeus's sons didn't know me, and they certainly did not know what I was. After eating in silence with them at the kitchen counter, I brought a plate to Elufeus. He was historically opposed to what he called my tricks, but rarely refused a plate of hot food. When I brought dinner to him in his room that night, the steam was dancing off the plate. Elufeus's whole house was full of books. He'd spent his many years of entrapment at the lighthouse trading them with the sailors passing through, and now they were everywhere. If ever I wanted to set something down, I inevitably had to move around at least 3 or 4 stacks just to make room. His reading collection was rather impressive, particularly for a man of his station. If he had not been a working man, Elufeus thought, he would have spent his whole life as a scholar. I often told him Elufeus was more of a scholar than most scholars I'd met, and sometimes that would satisfy him, but often it didn't. Personally, I'd taken great pleasure in his literary collection, while thanks to Elufeus's memory, I had access to every book he'd ever read. There's something different about reading a book for yourself. It's like the difference between hearing a song hummed and singing it yourself. Apparently, while the rest of us had been out in the other kitchen eating supper, Elufeus had been in here, pontificating on one particular short pile of 3 leather-bound hardbacks, a stack of my own making, one I'd left behind the other night after keeping my nightly watch over him and his health. There were 3 books by the same author, rather written across 3 separate lifetimes by the same author in a sense. She was an Indivic Pharoah from the Felled Lands. He pointed shakily at the pile with one pale, bony finger. "I'm curious as to whether you've reached any conclusions on those," he said once I'd finally cleared enough room to set down his dinner plate and reach down for the bed tray. "They're interesting," I answered mindlessly. I was absorbed with the tray, which was being stubborn as usual and not unfolding. "You know," he said, "the one on the top of that stack, the writer of that one, is alive." "Funny," I said. "Usually writers are dead." I looked down at Elufeus. An amused smirk played at the corner of his mouth. I got the table settled on top of his blankets. "Usually writers are dead. Most people are dead," he said. "I swear, your sense of humor grows grimmer every day." He chuckled to himself as I put the steaming hot plate of food down. "Ah, the sun was apparently out today. The solar cells must be very happy," he said, already with a cheek full of food, blissfully mute to his own principles for the sake of a hot meal. I indulged him. "You missed it because you were sleeping all day. It was positively blinding out. Actually, I think I might have burned my cheeks." We shared a laugh. When it was past, Elufeus rested his fork on the side of his plate and looked towards the candles on the far side of the room. "You know, my friend, I like to think about the sun shining after I'm gone. That's what makes me happy these days." I swelled with love for the man. That's an excellent reason to feel happy. His eyes and thoughts returned to the stack of books. "If I were a man of your means, Gabriel," he eyed me, "I would travel. I would go meet with great minds, maybe go to Vehronica, maybe meet someone like," he nodded towards the books, "like her." It hurt to think into the future like that. I felt like he just pressed down on a bruise. "I'll travel," I assured him. Again. He recognized my pain. When I had first arrived there, I was exhausted with traveling. He'd known how to treat me, known the fatigues of a sailor finally at port. In so many ways, we'd always envied each other, but he did not envy my pain. He knew it was not like his. not bound by time or identity or any other material. My agony had nowhere to end. It had nowhere to rest. He put his hand on mine. I received this kind gesture, then tittered. I would maybe reconsider what you call a great mind. I thought you enjoyed the women's writings. I glanced over at the books in question. The top was a thin paperback pamphlet of only a few dozen pages, a philosophical essay about business negotiations. I could admit to myself even then that there was something about its logic, simultaneously labyrinthine and blunt, that drew me in. The writer's unique strain of religiosity, Pharisaism, was, as all Indivic religions are, named after herself. I'd met her kind before. Enjoyed, sure, but I'm afraid you've never met a practicing Indivic before, I said. They get worse the richer they are. Trust me. I leaned back in my chair. Narcissism of hellish proportions. Could be rather interesting, don't you think? Elufeus said. Something between and a scoff shot right out of me. Interesting, sure. Elufeus's crumbling teeth formed a grin under his beard. You wouldn't even need to read their minds, he chuckled. People with great power are like roadkill. Their guts are all on the outside. He laughed the dead man's laugh, wild, irresponsible, and shortly derailing into a rather alarming coughing fit. Elufeus's sons came storming into the room to check on him. I passed them back and went back into the kitchen where I could conjure up a hot cup of honey lemon tea. Elufeus's sons were a bit baffled when I returned. They asked how I'd gotten the tea hot, and I explained it away with something about an emergency fire kit. They didn't ask too many more questions. We were all simply relieved for Elufeus's coughing to cease and for the cottage to settle back into its familiar silence. Later on that night, after his sons had gone to sleep, I sat at Elufeus's bedside on my typical night watch. The edges of the furniture shone dull and silver, the moonlight pouring into the room like cold water. Elufeus woke around the witching hour, his sleepy eyes catching the light, and he turned to me. Gabriel, he spoke drowsily, as if he was still half dreaming. I have not forgotten why you first came here. I sat up in my chair. You said you were glad when I said no to your offer. His eyes searched my face. Are you still? I nodded. You made your own choice, and that's what made me glad. So, yes. I never wondered if Elufeus would change his mind. In reality, when I'd made the proposal, it hadn't been much of a question. I'd traveled here after meeting so many sailors who'd spoken of the sage of Split Rock, but the moment I'd met him, I'd known what his decision would be. This was always going to be his ending, here in this bed, as the life withered away from him. I was so vulnerable all those years, he said with the shock of a man who just survived an attack. All those sailors, they could have slit my throat, kidnapped my sons, looted the place. He shook his head. But they didn't. They didn't want to kill me. I knew it was because of the way I am. They had a kindness for me because of it. I nodded. People cherish what you have, my friend. You do not want to see it gone from this world. You're lucky to have born this way. I sighed. And we're lucky it was you, carrying the torch. He smiled a faded smile. I'm lucky to have made it this far, with my sons here. And I'm glad to have met you, Gabriel. In my life, you were, he chuckled, an unexpected twist. There was a moment of still, quiet remembering between us. It had been a rare, sun-blinding afternoon out on the shore when Elufeus first realized who and what I really was. And even now, when he recalled that first revelation, it sent chills down his spine. "What amazes me," I said, "is that you're going somewhere even I cannot follow. Now that is an adventure, and one you are owed, dear friend." I called it an adventure, but it felt like anything but. I felt as though my world was about to drastically shrink by the size of one person, and not one I was willing to lose. I tried my very best not to let him see, but it felt as though the walls of this world were closing in on me. Elufeus fell back into his slumber and left me alone in the land of the conscious. I could see that he dreamt of his wife, the beautiful black-haired woman whose face, 25 years after her death, he could not admit to even himself he'd forgotten. We were playing the end out now. I was bracing myself for his death. It would be, for me, an unavoidable passage, a river that already had swept me up in its currents. I would eventually get spit back out onto the shore. And when I did, what reality was already waiting for me to arrive?